She stepped off that wagon and the whole town burst out laughing. A big woman in a dusty dress, clutching a worn leather bag, chin up like she hadn't heard a single word. But she had. Every last one. They called her the joke bride, the one nobody wanted, the one who wouldn't last a week on Coulter Vane's ranch. Coulter Vane, the hardest, coldest rancher in Red Flint Valley. A man who'd already sent 4 women packing before the first frost hit. Nobody gave Marlo Quinn a single chance. They had no idea what was coming. If you've ever been counted out before you even began, this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this ride travels. Red Flint Valley, late autumn. The wagon hit the rut hard enough to knock Marlo Quinn's hat clean off her head. She grabbed it before it could roll out the back, one quick practiced motion, and jammed it down over her tangled brown hair without a word. The driver, a leathery old man named Dupree, who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and horse sweat, didn't even glance back. He'd been paid to deliver her to the Vane Ranch, not to make conversation, and he'd made that arrangement clear about 40 miles outside of Millhaven when she'd tried to ask him what the valley was like. Rough, he'd said. That was it. One word, and then silence for the better part of 2 days. Marlo had spent those 2 days watching the landscape change. Back east, the hills were soft and green, full of maple trees that had just started throwing their colors, orange and gold and deep, burning red. Beautiful country, gentle country, country that forgave you for being tired. This was not that. Red Flint Valley announced itself like a fist. Flat, brown, cracked earth stretched out in every direction under a sky so wide it felt almost threatening. The mountains in the far distance were gray and jagged and unforgiving. The scrub brush along the road was the yellow-brown color of old teeth. Even the light was different out here, harder, more direct, like it was looking for something wrong with you specifically. She pressed her lips together and watched it pass. She had a habit of doing that, pressing her lips together when she was deciding something. Her mother had always said it made her look stubborn. Marlo figured her mother wasn't wrong. Dupree hauled back on the reins as they crested a low rise, and the town of Red Flint appeared below them. A main street of maybe 12 buildings, a livery stable, a church that looked like it was losing an argument with gravity, and enough mud to swallow a man whole. Smoke climbed from 2 or 3 chimneys. A dog barked from somewhere invisible. "That's it," Dupree said. "I can see that," Marlo said. He clicked his tongue and the horses started down the slope. She felt them before she saw them. That particular pressure of eyes on your back, the shift in the air when people stop what they're doing and turn to look. By the time the wagon pulled up to the general store, there were maybe 15 people visible on the street, and every single one of them had stopped moving. Marlo sat up straighter on the wagon bench, which was a mistake, because it made her more visible. And more visible was apparently all it took. The laugh started with a kid, couldn't have been more than 12, gap-toothed and sunburned, standing outside the mercantile with a broom he'd forgotten to sweep with. He made a sound that was half giggle and half something crueler, and nudged the boy next to him. And then there were 2 of them snickering, and then someone's mother didn't bother to shush them. And then a man in a canvas apron standing in the doorway of what looked like a feed store said something to the man beside him, low and sideways, and both of them laughed outright. Marlo heard the word fat clearly enough. She caught enormous from someone else. A woman near the water trough covered her mouth, but her eyes were bright with it. She climbed down from the wagon herself because Dupree showed no signs of helping, and getting down was the only part that required any grace, and she didn't have much grace to spare, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. One hand on the wagon board, step down, steady, don't stumble, don't give them the fall they're waiting for. She didn't fall. She stood on the packed dirt street with her bag in her hand and looked straight ahead, at nothing in particular, while the laughter sorted itself out into whispers and open stares. "That's her?" A woman's voice, not bothering to be quiet. "That's the one Coulter's agency sent?" "Lord have mercy," someone answered. "She won't last 3 days." "I'll give her 2. Marlo set her jaw and walked toward the general store, which seemed like the sensible place to ask where the Vane Ranch was, and she kept her face absolutely neutral, which was its own kind of hard work. The kind that doesn't show but costs you something anyway. The woman behind the counter of the general store was named Gertrude Holt, and she had the sharp, appraising eyes of someone who had spent 30 years watching people reveal themselves through their purchases. She looked Marlo over once, top to bottom, without any particular cruelty but without any warmth either, and said, "You're the Quinn woman." "Marlowe Quinn," Marlowe said. "Yes, ma'am." "You know what you're getting into?" "I know what was in the arrangement." Gertrude made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a judgment. Coulter Vane's had 4 brides from that agency in the past 2 years. None of them stayed. One of them cried the entire wagon ride back to Mill Haven, apparently. Nobody blames them. "I'm not them," Marlowe said. Gertrude studied her for another moment. Then she turned and pointed out the window at a road that forked north past the livery stable. "Vane Ranch is about 6 miles up that road. Can't miss it. There's a gate with the brand on it, a V inside a circle. Dupree know where he's going?" "I'll tell him." "You got any idea what cattle ranching actually involves?" "I grew up on a working farm," Marlowe said. "Not cattle, hogs mostly, and some chickens. Enough to know that animals are animals and work is work." Gertrude looked at her for one more beat, and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, more like a recalculation. "Well," she said, "good luck to you." It wasn't much, but it was the most honest thing anyone in Red Flint had said to her yet. Coulter Vane was in the east pasture when the wagon came through his gate, and he knew about it before he saw it because his dog, a cattle dog named Rope, went still in that particular way he had when something was coming up the road that he wasn't sure about yet. Coulter straightened up from the fence post he'd been mending, the 3rd one this week, because the soil on the east side had gone soft from the last rainfall and the posts were shifting, and watched the wagon approach. Dupree, from Mill Haven. He recognized the rig. He pulled off his gloves and walked toward the yard. He was a tall man, Coulter Vane, 41 years old, though he looked older in the way men who work outside in hard weather always look older. The sun had carved lines into his face that made him look like someone had taken a knife to tanned leather. He wasn't an ugly man, but he wasn't a warm one. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray, and they didn't give much away. His jaw was always set like he was expecting an argument. He'd been expecting this, technically. The agency had sent word 8 days ago. A woman named Marlowe Quinn, 26 years old, from Pennsylvania. Capable and resilient, the letter had said, in the careful language of an outfit that was trying very hard to place someone difficult to place. He hadn't thought much about it. He never did anymore. He'd learned not to build expectations around arrangements that tended to fall apart before winter. The wagon stopped in the yard. Dupree climbed down stiffly, nodded at Coulter without making eye contact, and started unstrapping a trunk from the back. Coulter watched the wagon's passenger climb down on her own, careful, methodical, one hand on the board, and then stand in his yard with a bag in her hand and look at him. He looked back. He registered it without judgment, the way you register weather, a large woman, heavy through the shoulders and hips, solid as a barrel, with a round face that was flushed from the cold and the ride. Her brown hair was escaping from under a battered hat. Her clothes were practical, heavy cotton, sensible boots that had been worn in but not worn out. She met his eyes without flinching, which was more than most people managed. "Mr. Vane," she said. "Miss Quinn," he said. A pause. He'd always been terrible at these moments. He never knew what was expected of him. "You want to show me where things are?" she asked. "Or should I figure it out myself?" It wasn't quite a challenge. It wasn't quite a question. It landed somewhere in between, and Coulter found himself looking at her for a half-second longer than he'd intended before he said, "Come on then," and turned toward the house. The house was not what she'd hoped for, and not quite as bad as she'd feared. It was solidly built. That was something. Log construction, 2 rooms on the ground floor, and a sleeping loft. A stone fireplace that was doing its best with a fire that had been left too low. The floor was swept, but not scrubbed. The kitchen showed signs of a man eating whatever came most easily. An iron pot with the remains of something she couldn't identify. A few tins on the shelf. A bread loaf that had gone stale enough to function as a weapon. Coulter stood in the doorway and let her look. "I'm not much for cooking," he said. It sounded like a warning. "I gathered," she said, picking up the bread and checking its weight. She set it back down. "There's a second room off the back. That's where you'll sleep." She nodded. She'd been told the arrangement was practical, not romantic. That suited her fine, better than fine, actually. She hadn't come out here for romance. She'd come because her options in Pennsylvania had narrowed considerably after her father's death and her brother's decision to sell the farm. And this had been a real option, an actual place, actual work, a roof that didn't belong to someone else. She was clear-eyed about what it was. "Outhouse?" she asked. He pointed out the back window. "Water?" "Well's out front. Pump sometimes sticks. You gotta rock it twice before you pull." "Animals?" "Cattle are in the south pasture, 23 head. Horses in the barn, 3 of them. There's a barn cat that doesn't earn his keep, and Rope." As if on cue, the cattle dog appeared in the doorway behind Coulter, nose working. He looked at Marlowe with his head slightly tilted. "Rope," she said. The dog looked at Coulter. Coulter said nothing. The dog walked over to Marlowe and sniffed her hand. "He doesn't usually do that," Coulter said. "Animals are generally better judges than people," she said, and scratched the dog behind the ear. Coulter watched this. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted just slightly, the way a weather vane moves before the wind actually arrives. "Supper's your lookout," he said. "I'll be in the barn till dark." "All right," she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen of his cold, spare house, with her bag on the floor and the dog sitting on her boot, and she looked at what she'd walked into and she thought, well, this is what it is. Then she found the wood box, put 2 logs on the fire, and started in on making something edible out of a man's idea of a stocked kitchen. What she found in this pantry: 3 cans of beans, a sack of cornmeal, some salt pork that was still good, half an onion that was not, dried peppers, coffee, and a jar of something she eventually identified as preserved peaches. She used the beans and the salt pork and the peppers and the cornmeal, and by the time Coulter came in from the barn, she had a pot of something hot and a skillet of cornbread, which was more than he'd had in one sitting for what looked like a while based on the state of his kitchen. He sat down at the table without a word and ate. She sat across from him with her own portion and ate too. The silence was, she searched for the right word, functional. Not hostile, not comfortable. Just 2 people who didn't know each other yet, eating in a house where the fire had warmed things up to something close to decent. "It's good," he said. Eventually. She didn't say thank you because it would have sounded like she'd been waiting for it. She just said, "Cornbread'll be better tomorrow. Oven's uneven. I need to figure out the hot spots." He looked at her across the table. "You cook often?" he asked. "I've cooked every day since I was 9, she said. "Not always well, but often." Another silence. Rope settled under the table. "The ranch hands come at sunup," Coulter said. 3 of them. They work the cattle. Fencing, feeding, driving. You're not expected to— "What am I expected to do?" she asked. Direct, not aggressive, just direct. He seemed thrown by this slightly. "The house. Cooking. Mending. Keeping track of supplies." "I can do that," she said. "I'll also want to learn the cattle work." He stared at her. "Not to take over," she said. "To be useful, in case you need an extra hand." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "We'll see." She'd heard "we'll see" her whole life as a polite way of saying no. But she let it go. She'd made her position known. What he did with it was his business for now. The ranch hands showed up at sunrise, as promised. There were 3 of them. A young Mexican man named Cisco, who was short and quick and already had laugh lines around his eyes, at what couldn't have been more than 22. An older hand named Barton, who had the permanently suspicious expression of someone who'd been disappointed enough times to stop being surprised. And a man called Dutch, who was big and blonde, and took one look at Marlowe and turned to say something to Barton that she was absolutely certain she didn't want to hear. She was 20 feet away when it happened, close enough to catch the shape of it, even if she missed the words. Barton's expression didn't change. Dutch laughed at his own joke. Cisco looked at the ground. Marlowe carried her water bucket from the well to the kitchen and said nothing. She noticed that Coulter was already in the yard when the hands arrived, already giving orders, already moving. He didn't introduce her. He didn't say anything about her at all. She wasn't sure if that was indifference or the way things were done out here, and she'd decided not to interpret it either way until she had more information. She was good at that, holding judgment until she had information. It was one of the more useful habits she'd developed, She got through the morning by working. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, which took the better part of an hour, and produced water that was the color of old tobacco. She took stock of the actual state of the pantry and wrote a list. She went through the back room, her room, and found that it had a good window and a decent rope mattress, and a chest of drawers with 3 drawers that stuck and one that opened fine. She unstuck the 3. She made her bed with the blankets from her trunk. She was coming back through the yard for more water when she nearly walked into Dutch. He was coming out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her, but stopped, and looked her over with an expression that wasn't quite contempt but was in the same neighborhood, and then smiled, but not the kind of smile that meant anything friendly. "You're still here," he said. "Figured you'd have gone by now." "Why would I go?" she said. He shrugged. The others did. After a day or two, said it was too hard. "I just got here." "Yeah." His eyes traveled over her again. "Well, don't expect Coulter to go easy on you. He doesn't go easy on anyone." "I'm not expecting easy," she said. He seemed to be waiting for something, some evidence of upset, maybe, or doubt. She gave him nothing. After a moment he walked on, and she filled her bucket and went back to the house. The thing about the first week was that it was, in fact, genuinely hard. Not in ways she hadn't known work could be hard. She'd grown up working, she understood hard, but in specific, relentless ways that added up faster than she'd calculated. The cold came in under the door no matter how she stuffed the gap with cloth. The pump stuck every single morning despite the twice-rocking trick. The stove ran hot on the right and cold on the left, which meant everything she cooked on the left had to be moved eventually, and everything on the right had to be watched like it was alive. The sleeping room was warmer than the main room, but somehow felt colder. Something about the walls not being as thick, the wind finding its way through in a way that wasn't a draft exactly, but was a persistent chill that sat on your face while you slept. And there was the elevation. She hadn't expected the elevation. Back east, you didn't notice it. Out here, at the height of Red Flint Valley, her body had to remember how to breathe. And for the first 3 or 4 days, everything felt like she was working slightly underwater. She didn't say any of this to anyone. She woke before the hands arrived, started the fire, made coffee and whatever breakfast could be made quickly, and when Coulter came in from his morning rounds, he was always up before her, always already outside. She never did figure out when exactly he slept. She had something hot on the table. He never commented on it. He sat and ate and drank his coffee and left. She cleaned up and got on with the day. On the 4th morning, the water in the pump had partly frozen overnight, and it took her 20 minutes of work to get it moving again. And by the time she got back to the kitchen, her hands were the dull red of someone who'd been outside much longer than 20 minutes in air. This cold, and she stood at the stove and pressed them flat against the iron and breathed through the ache of the warming. There's a trick to the pump in cold weather. She turned around. Coulter was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hand. She hadn't heard him come in. "I'd welcome knowing it," she said. "Keep a bucket of water on the hearth at night. Not much, just enough to pour down the shaft before you try to work it. Warms the seals." She thought about this. That would have been useful to know 4 days ago. He looked at his hat. "I know." She turned back to the stove. "Thank you," she said. A pause. "Coffee's ready?" she added. She heard him pull out the chair and sit down. On the 5th day, she asked Cisco to show her how to move cattle. She'd watched the hands working all week, the way they read an animal's weight and direction, the way a cattle dog like Rope worked the edges of a herd, the difference between a cow that was going where you wanted it and one that was thinking about somewhere else entirely. She'd been watching because that's how she learned things, and she'd decided she understood enough of the theory to try the practice. Cisco looked at her with an expression that was politely uncertain. Mr. Vane didn't say, "Mr. Vane said we'll see," she said, which isn't a no. "And you're moving the south herd to the water access today, right? You're short. Barton's mending the east fence. I'm offering to help." Cisco looked at her for another moment, then looked at Rope, who was sitting next to Marlowe's boot in what had already become his regular position. "Dog likes her," Cisco said, apparently to himself. "Dog has good taste," Marlowe said. He almost smiled. "Okay," he said. "Come on then, I'll show you." She was terrible at it. There was no other honest way to describe the first hour. She kept going to the wrong side of the animal. She didn't read the hesitations right. And twice she got herself into positions where the cow just walked around her like she was a rock in the road. Cisco was patient about it in the way that people who've always been good at something are patient with someone who isn't, careful and a little bemused. But she paid attention and she adjusted, and by the third hour she was making fewer mistakes. And by the time they had the herd at the water access, she'd gotten close enough to useful that Cisco said, "Not bad for someone who's never done it," which, from Cisco, she was starting to understand was a fairly significant compliment. She didn't realize until she was walking back to the house that her boots were soaked through. Her shoulder ached from a fall she'd taken in the second hour that she hadn't mentioned, and she was happier than she'd been in weeks. Coulter saw it. He'd been watching, on and off, since the third day. Not obviously. He had his own work to do, and he was genuinely doing it, but he'd registered her movements through the ranch in the way that he registered everything on his land, with the particular attention of a man whose survival had always depended on noticing what was happening around him. He'd noticed the pump. He'd noticed that she hadn't come to him about it, and then he'd felt something that he chose not to examine too closely. Some version of guilt, maybe, for not telling her at the start. And that's when he'd finally said something. 4 days later, which was longer than it should have been. He'd noticed her with Cisco and the cattle, too, from the north fence where he was checking the line. He'd watched her fall and get up without any particular drama, and then try again. He'd watched Rope work with her like she was someone he knew. The other women, 4 of them, and he carried the weight of each departure differently, though he never talked about any of it, had lasted between 2 days and 2 weeks. They'd arrived expecting something that the reality of this ranch didn't provide, and when the reality became clear, they'd made the only sensible decision available to them and gone back to wherever they came from. He didn't blame them for it. He'd never blamed them. But none of them had asked Cisco to teach them cattle work. He turned back to the fence line and told himself it didn't mean anything yet. The trip into town for supplies happened on the 8th day. Coulter drove the wagon himself. He always did supply runs himself. She'd learn later because he didn't trust anyone else's accounting of what was needed. And Marlowe rode beside him with her list. He'd looked at the list that morning before they left, working through it in silence, and she'd waited to see if he'd cut anything. He hadn't cut anything. They were halfway to Red Flint when he said, without preamble, "Town's going to stare." "Town already stared," she said, "when I arrived." "It'll be worse with me." She thought about this. "Because you're bringing me into town, making it official." Something like that. "Does that bother you?" A long pause. "I don't generally care what Red Flint thinks of my business," he said. "I just want you to know it'll happen." She looked out at the road ahead. "I know what I look like, Mr. Vane. I've always known what I look like. I've had 26 years to get used to what people do with that information." He said nothing. "You don't need to apologize for them," she added, "or warn me, or feel bad about it. I'm telling you I can manage it." Another long silence. Then, All right, she said. They drove on. The stairs in Red Flint were as promised, and then some. She walked into the general store with her list, while Coulter tied the horses, and Gertrude Holt was behind the counter, and there were 3 other women in the store who stopped talking when Marlowe came in. She could feel the shape of the conversation they'd been having. Something about her clearly, something that had the slightly charged quality of gossip that's gone back and forth a few times and gotten more embellished with each pass. She put her list onto the counter and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Holt." "You're still here," Gertrude said, and it came out with an undertone that wasn't quite the cruelty of the women who were staring. It was something more complicated, something that sounded, if Marlowe was reading it right, almost like surprise. "I'm still here," Marlowe confirmed. 8 days, Gertrude said. 8 days, Marlowe said. The other women were whispering now. She caught her name. She caught something about Coulter Vane and can't believe he, and then her name again. She kept her face on the list. Coulter came in while Gertrude was pulling items from the shelf. The shift in the room when he walked in was immediate and physical. The women stopped whispering, rearranged themselves slightly, and the particular kind of performance that people put on when they want someone to think they weren't just talking about him, began. He went straight to the hardware section without acknowledging anyone, which was apparently normal behavior from Coulter Vane in the general store. One of the women, young, well-dressed by Red Flint standards, with a careful arrangement of curls under her bonnet, drifted toward Marlowe. Her name, Marlowe would learn later, was Vera Hutchins. Her family owned the second largest spread in the valley. "You're the Quinn woman," she said. Pleasant enough tone. Eyes not so much. "That's right," Marlowe said. "You've been at the Vane Ranch a week? 8 days. How are you finding it?" And the smile was just a little too interested, just a little too pointed. "Hard work," Marlowe said pleasantly. "Good land." "The other women found it quite impossible," Vera said. "We all felt terrible for them." "I'm sure," Marlowe said. Vera waited. She seemed to want something more than that. Some admission of difficulty, some crack. Marlowe gave her nothing. After a moment, Vera smiled again, the tight version, and turned away. Coulter appeared at Marlowe's elbow with a coil of wire and 2 boxes of nails. "Ready?" he said. "Just about," she said. He put the hardware on the counter and waited. He didn't look at Vera Hutchins. He didn't look at the other women. He stood at the counter next to Marlowe while Gertrude tallied the supplies. And while everything about him said this is just a supply run, everything about the women in the store said they were storing up this moment to examine later. Marlowe helped load the wagon, and they drove back toward the ranch without talking much, which had become its own kind of comfort. The particular silence of 2 people who'd learned each other's rhythms enough to rest inside the quiet without filling it. The mountains in the west had gone purple in the late afternoon light. The air smelled like coming cold. "Vera Hutchins," Coulter said, about 4 miles out of town. "I noticed," Marlowe said. "Her father wants my grazing rights on the North Range." She turned to look at him. "Has for a while," he said. "He's been trying different methods of persuasion." She filed this away. "Is that relevant to what she said to me?" "Might be," he said. "Eventually." She looked back at the road. "Good to know," she said. The wagon rolled on. The wind picked up. The day's light started losing its argument with the dark, the way it did out here. Faster than back east, more total somehow, like the land had decided the day was over and wasn't accepting discussion. Marlowe tucked her coat tighter and thought about grazing rights, and about Vera Hutchins' careful smile, and about the way Coulter had just told her something, for no practical reason she could see except that she should probably know it. He told her something. She considered that on the rest of the drive home, and she pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was deciding something, and by the time they got back to the ranch and she started on supper, she had made a quiet decision that she intended to keep for a good long while. She was not leaving Red Flint Valley. Not for cold, and not for a stuck pump, and not for a woman with careful curls and a calculating smile. Not for any of it. She put the beans on to soak and started the cornbread, and did not tell anyone what she'd decided because she'd learned a long time ago that decisions like this one didn't need an audience. They just needed to be made and held and carried forward every day until they became so solid that nothing could move them. Rope settled under the table. Outside in the barn, she could hear Coulter moving around, the sound of a man ending his day in the way he always ended it, with work, in the dark, by himself. She got on with supper. That was the 8th day. Winter arrived in Red Flint Valley the way bad news arrives. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one worse than the last. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Marlowe had stepped off Dupree's wagon. She woke to find the water bucket beside the stove frozen solid despite the fire she'd banked the night before, and the gap under the back door had grown wide enough overnight that a thin line of snow had pushed its way inside and was sitting on the floorboards like it belonged there. She swept it out, rebuilt the fire, and heated the bucket over the flame until the ice cracked and gave up. She did not mention it to anyone. What she was learning, slowly and through the specific education of daily failure and daily recovery, was that the ranch ran on a kind of grim momentum. Nothing was ever fully fixed. Everything was either currently breaking or had recently been broken or was about to break, and the work of maintaining the place was essentially the work of staying one step ahead of the deterioration. The east fence kept shifting. The barn roof had a soft spot on the north side that Coulter patched twice and that came loose again both times. One of the horses, the big gray gelding named August, had developed a tendency to favor his left front leg in cold weather, which meant he couldn't be worked hard until the temperature climbed, which in the current circumstances meant he was costing them a third of their draft capacity at the moment they needed it most. Coulter dealt with all of this the way he dealt with everything. Steadily, silently, without complaint and without much conversation. He was up before her every morning, in from the barn late every evening, and in between he worked with a concentration that was almost frightening to watch. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was so complete. When Coulter Vane was fixing a fence, there was nothing in the world except that fence. She'd never seen anyone so fully inside their own work. She found it, after some initial awkwardness about how to be in the same spaces as a man who didn't talk unless he had something specific to say. Oddly restful. She wasn't required to perform. She wasn't required to be pleasant or entertaining or anything other than useful, in a life that had demanded a lot of performance from her. The performance of not being hurt by the things people said. The performance of being fine. The performance of taking up as little space as possible despite the irony of her physical presence. The ranch's blunt indifference to everything except function was something close to a relief. She was scrubbing this kitchen table one morning, about 4 weeks in, when Barton came to the back door. She'd been watching Barton since the first day. He was the ranch hand she'd identified as the most likely problem. Not because he was loud about it, like Dutch, but because he was quiet about it in a way that was harder to read. He did his work without complaint. He never spoke to her directly if he could help it. But she'd caught him watching her with that specific expression, not hatred exactly, more like a man waiting to be proven right about something. She opened the back door and he stood there with his hat in his hands, which she hadn't expected. "One of the heifers got into the north gully," he said. "She's stuck. Cisco's out at the far pasture and Dutch is with Mr. Vane at the water line. I need another set of hands." She looked at him. He looked back. It was costing him something, asking her, and they both knew it. "Give me 2 minutes," she said. She put on her coat and her heaviest gloves and her boots, and she followed him out to the north gully. And what she found there was a young heifer who had gotten herself wedged into a narrow cut in the frozen earth about 4 feet down, one leg twisted under her, eyes wide with the rolling white panic of an animal that has fully understood it's in trouble. "How long has she been down there?" Marlowe asked. "Found her maybe 20 minutes ago," Barton said. "Tried to loop a rope around her, but she's too panicked. Keeps fighting it." Marlowe crouched at the edge of the gully and looked at the animal for a long moment. Then she said, "Let me go down. It's a 4-foot drop onto frozen ground." "I can see that." Barton looked at her with that expression again, the waiting to be proved right expression, and she ignored it and lowered herself over the edge, dropped, landed hard on both feet, and felt the cold of the ground come straight through the soles of her boots like a judgment. The heifer tried to scramble away from her, which in its current position meant mostly just thrashing, which was making things worse. Marlowe went still. She'd learned with the cattle that stillness was often the first useful thing. Animals reading intent from movement, from pressure, from the specific quality of a person's attention. She breathed slow and let the heifer settle enough to realize she wasn't being rushed. "Easy," she said, low and even. "Easy now." "I know." It took a few minutes. Barton crouched up at the edge, watching in silence. The heifer's breathing slowed from full panic to just afraid, and Marlowe moved in carefully and got her hands on the animal's side, feeling the twisted leg, assessing. Not broken. Wedged and pulled, but not broken. She worked the leg free inch by inch, talking the whole time in that low, flat voice, and when the heifer finally got her feet under her and stood, shaking in the narrow gully floor, Marlowe stepped back and let Barton's rope drop over her head from above. Getting the animal out was a different problem, and a worse one. It required Barton pulling from above and Marlowe pushing from below, which was awkward and ugly, and involved Marlowe getting knocked sideways twice by the heifer's hind end before the animal finally scrambled up and over the edge. Marlowe pulled herself out after, using the rope as a handhold, and stood in the wind at the edge of the gully with mud on her coat and her shoulder aching again from where she'd hit the frozen ground. Barton was checking the heifer's leg. He didn't look at her. "She'll be all right," he said. "I think so," Marlowe said. A pause. The wind moved between them. "You didn't have to go down there," Barton said, still not looking at her. "Faster than talking about it," she said. He finally looked at her. His expression hadn't softened exactly, but something in it had shifted. The waiting quality was gone. In its place was something more like assessment. He was looking at her the way he'd look at a fence post he'd expected to be rotten and had found to be solid. He nodded once, turned, and led the heifer back toward the barn. She followed and didn't make anything of it, and that was the right call. She found out later that evening that Barton had said something to Cisco that Cisco then repeated to her quietly while they were bringing in the evening water. What Barton had said was, "She knows what she's doing." 6 words from a man who used words like, "they cost him personally," which Marlowe understood was as close to a formal endorsement as she was ever going to get from him. Dutch was a different calculation entirely. Dutch was loud and opinionated and had decided in those first few days that Marlowe Quinn was a joke that had wandered onto his work site, and he'd made that decision so completely that he seemed genuinely unable to update it, even as the evidence accumulated against it. She'd heard him in the barn one evening, not long after the gully incident, talking to August the horse about her in terms that were neither creative nor original, but were specific enough that she went still outside the barn door for a moment before she kept walking. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself it and mostly believed it. The thing was, and she was honest with herself about this in the way she tried to be honest with herself about most things, it did matter. Not in the way that a physical wound mattered, not with that kind of immediacy, but it worked on her in the slow, persistent way that cold water works on stone. Every morning she had to pick up the same weight and carry it through the same day, and some days the weight was heavier than others. And the days when she could hear Dutch's voice on the other side of a wall, the weight was heavier. She got very good at not showing it. Coulter, she noticed, never heard Dutch. Or if he heard him, he processed it differently, filed it somewhere that didn't require immediate action. She'd observed enough of how Coulter Vane managed his ranch to understand that he made decisions about people slowly and deliberately and didn't reverse them once made, which cut both ways. He'd decided the hands were essential and kept them on. He'd decided Dutch was Dutch and dealt with that as a category rather than a repeated problem. She wasn't sure yet what he'd decided about her. The second supply run into town happened on a Thursday, 5 weeks after her arrival, and this time Coulter had business at the land office as well, which meant they'd be in Red Flint for longer than a supply run normally required. He told her this the night before, sitting across from her at the table with his coffee, in the tone of someone providing logistical information. "The land office," she said. "Renewing the grazing lease on the North Range," he said. "Should be routine, but Hutchins has been making noise about a competing claim. His lawyer's been in contact with the land agent." She absorbed this. "Is there grounds for a competing claim?" "Not legally. The lease is mine through next spring." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "But Hutchins has got money, and I've got the law, and out here those two things are closer to even than they should be." She'd been thinking about the land situation since he'd first mentioned it on the drive back from town. She'd been thinking about it in the particular way she thought about problems she didn't have enough information on yet. Storing pieces, waiting for more. How long has he been after the North Range? 2 years. Since his wife's cousin came out from back east and they started expanding the Hutchins operation. He paused. He's bought out 3 smaller ranches in the valley in the past 18 months. Bought out or pressured out? Coulter looked at her. Somewhere between the two, mostly. She nodded. She kept her face even, but something in her had gone alert in the way it did when a problem clarified from general to specific. "All right," she said. "What time do we leave tomorrow?" They left at sunrise. The land office visit went the way Coulter had half predicted, technically fine and quietly hostile. The land agent was a man named Pell, who had the carefully neutral face of someone being paid by one party, but answerable to another, and he processed Coulter's renewal paperwork with a thoroughness that took twice as long as it should have, and included several questions about the current productive use of the North Range that were phrased neutrally but pointed clearly toward a particular kind of scrutiny. Coulter answered everything in flat monosyllables. Marlowe sat in the hard chair beside him and listened and watched Pell's face and thought about what she was seeing. She was still thinking about it when they came out of the land office onto the main street. That was when she heard it. She heard it before she could see where it was coming from. A specific kind of laughter, the public kind, designed to carry. It was coming from outside the feed store, where a knot of men had gathered, 4 or 5 of them. She recognized Vera Hutchins' father, a solid, broad man named Warren Hutchins, from the description Coulter had given. He was standing in the center of the group, and he was talking loudly, and she couldn't hear the exact words at first, but she could hear the rhythm of them, the performance of them, and then she caught the shape of what he was saying, and then she caught the actual words. He He was telling a story about a cattle ranch that had taken in a house cow by mistake. The story wasn't subtle. The laughter from the men around him was the kind that wanted to be heard from a distance. Coulter had stopped walking. He was standing absolutely still on the boardwalk beside her, and she could see the muscle in his jaw working, and she could see his hands closing slowly at his sides. And she thought for one clear moment that he was about to walk across that street and do something that would cost them both more than it was worth. "Don't," she said. Quiet. Just for him. He looked at her. "Not here," she said. "Not like this." His jaw was still tight. "Marlowe?" "I know," she said. "But not here." He was breathing hard through his nose. Hutchins' story had reached its punchline, and the laughter was at its peak. One of the men in the group glanced over at them, glanced at Marlowe specifically, and nudged Hutchins, who turned and looked too, still smiling. Marlowe met Warren Hutchins' eyes across the street and held them. She didn't give him anything. Not anger, not embarrassment, not the hurt that was actually sitting in her chest like a stone. She gave him nothing at all. Just looked at him with the level, patient attention of someone who is keeping a very careful account. His smile changed slightly. Not much, but she caught it. The edge of something less comfortable. Then she looked away and said to Coulter, "Did you get everything you needed from Pell?" He took a moment. "Yes," he said. "Then let's go home," she said. They walked to the wagon. She climbed up on her own, same as always, and gathered her coat around her against the wind, and they drove out of Red Flint in silence while the laughter from the feed store faded behind them. About 2 miles out, Coulter said, "I should have said something." "You said nothing," she said. "That was the right call." "It wasn't right," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "It was just—" He stopped. "It was practical," she said. "There's a difference." Another mile of silence. "It happens a lot," he said, not asking. "Often enough," she said. "I've stopped counting." He didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure what there was to say to it, and she wasn't asking him to fix it. She'd never expected anyone to fix it. But it sat in the wagon with them for the rest of the drive home like a third passenger, and she was aware that it was the first time she'd admitted out loud, even obliquely, that the weight was real. She'd expected to feel worse for having said it. She didn't quite. There was something almost mechanical about the relief. Not comfort, just the specific lightness of a thing put down for a moment. That night after supper, while she was washing the dishes, Coulter came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, in the way he sometimes did when he had something to say and hadn't figured out the right order for it yet. "The North Range lease," he said finally. "If Hutchins gets it in front of a sympathetic judge, the paperwork might not be enough." She turned around. "What would be enough?" "Proof of productive use," he said. "Records. Livestock counts, water access logs, grazing rotations, documentation that the land's been actively worked." She wiped her hands on a cloth and leaned against the counter. "Do you have those records?" Some, he said. "Not organized. Not the kind of thing you'd want to put in front of a judge." She looked at him for a moment. "I can read and write," she said. "I kept my father's books for 6 years." He looked back at her. Something moved behind those washed-out gray eyes. Not quite surprise, but some revision of a prior assumption. "Show me what you have," she said. "I'll see what can be done with it." He went to the back room and came back with a wooden box. Inside the box was exactly the kind of record she'd expected. Receipts, notes, the occasional calendar page with numbers scrawled in the margins. Years of information, unmistakable in what it showed, but completely illegible to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. She sat down at the table with the box and started sorting. Coulter sat down across from her, which surprised her. She'd expected him to go back to whatever he usually did in the evenings. But he stayed, and after a moment he started pointing out what various entries meant, and she started writing it down in the clear, organized hand she'd learned doing her father's accounts. And the fire crackled and ropes slept under the table and the wind came off the mountains and hit the walls of the house and went around them. They worked until the lamp needed refilling, and then Coulter refilled it, and they kept going. She didn't think about what it looked like. 2 people at a table working through the night by lamplight. She thought about the records, and what they proved, and what else she might need to find out before whatever was coming arrived. She'd understood, watching Warren Hutchins smile across that street, that something was building. She didn't know the shape of it yet. But she'd lived long enough with the specific variety of cruelty that came wearing a smile to know that it didn't stop on its own. It stopped when you stopped it. She turned a page and kept writing, and outside the window, the stars over Red Flint Valley were hard and cold and very far away, and the night pressed in against the glass, and she pressed her lips together and kept going. The drought announced itself slowly, the way the worst things always do, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a series of small absences that added up to something catastrophic. First, the creek that fed the south pasture dropped to half its normal level. Coulter noted it, adjusted the grazing rotation, said nothing beyond the practical. Then the well in the yard started pulling slower, the water coming up cloudy at the end of each pump cycle where it had always run clear. Then the grass on the north range, the grazing land at the center of the dispute with Hutchins, went from winter brown to the particular gray tan of ground that was giving up. Coulter walked that range one morning in late January and came back with his jaw set and said nothing at supper, and Marlowe didn't push him, and they sat with the information between them like something neither of them was ready to name yet. She'd been on the ranch almost 3 months by then. The box of records had become an organized ledger, cross-referenced and dated, that she'd worked on in the evenings over the course of 2 weeks. She'd found patterns in it that she hadn't gone looking for. Irregularities in what the cattle prices had been returning at market against what comparable ranches in the valley were reportedly receiving. Numbers that were off by the kind of margin that could mean a bad season, or could mean something else entirely. She'd set those pages aside in a separate section and kept going with the primary ledger, and she hadn't said anything about them yet because she didn't have enough to say anything that meant something. She was learning that about this valley. Everything moved slow and deliberate, like the land itself was watching what you were going to do before it decided whether to cooperate. The livestock auction was announced in February, posted on the board outside Gertrude Holt's general store, and read aloud at the Saturday gathering outside the saloon that functioned as Red Flint's version of public information. It was the valley's first major auction of the season, cattle and horses both, with land leases on the side table for those interested, and attendance was effectively mandatory for any rancher in the valley who wanted to stay connected to the market. Coulter didn't want to go. He said this plainly on the Thursday before, sitting at the table with his coffee mug wrapped in both hands. I've bought and sold at those auctions before. The pricing's never been straight. How not straight? She asked. The auctioneers favor certain buyers, run up prices on sellers they don't like. He turned the mug. Hutchins has got influence over 2 of the 3 men on the auction committee. She looked at him. And you've let that go on. Wasn't worth fighting before. It might be worth it now, she said. If you don't sell at the auction, you lose standing. The North Range dispute is already making you look vulnerable. Skipping the auction reads like retreat. He was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed he did this. Went quiet, not because he disagreed, but because he was checking her logic against his own, doing the calculations in parallel. You'd come, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'd come, she said. He drank his coffee. Dutch won't come. He doesn't do auctions. Something happened at one a few years back. I never got the full story. Cisco and Barton will handle the cattle drive into town. All right. It'll be the whole valley, he said. Everyone. She understood what he was saying. I know, she said. I told you I can manage it. He looked at her with an expression she still didn't have a full vocabulary for. Something between respect and a kind of helpless regret that he seemed to carry about things he couldn't fix. I know you can, he said, which was not the same thing as being easy with it, and they both understood that. The auction was set for the last Saturday of February. In the 2 weeks before it, she kept working the numbers she'd set aside. She sent a letter through Gertrude Holt, who ran the town's mail, to a land records office in Mill Haven, asking for public documentation of water access agreements in Red Flint Valley going back 5 years. The letter cost her 30 cents of her own money, and she didn't tell Coulter about it. She framed the request as a general inquiry, nothing specific, and she waited. The response came back in 10 days, which was faster than she'd expected, because Millhaven apparently had a clerk who took unusual pride in the speed of his filing. What came back was 12 pages of public record, survey maps, water rights agreements, registered easements. She read it twice at the kitchen table after supper while Coulter was in the barn, and the second time through she went still in the particular way that meant something had just clicked into place. 3 water access agreements had been amended in the past 18 months. The amendments were registered quietly during a period when two of the valley's smaller ranchers were either sick or had already sold and left. The amendments redirected significant water access from communal creek rights toward private holdings, specifically toward land that was currently under Hutchins' control or that Hutchins had acquired. The signatures on the amendment requests included the land agent Pell, one of the auction committee members, and a third name she didn't immediately recognize. She sat with this for a long time. Then she folded the documents carefully and put them in the ledger box under her bed, and she went to sleep. And she lay in the dark listening to the wind off the mountains and thought about what she had and what it meant and whether she had enough. She didn't have enough yet. She had the shape of something. She needed the specifics. The night before the auction, she told Coulter. Not everything. She told him about the water access amendments, about Pell's signature, about the committee member. She showed him the documents. He sat at the table and read them once without expression and then read them again, and his hands, she noticed, were absolutely flat on the table. The kind of deliberate stillness that came from a decision not to let them do what they wanted to do. Pell, he said. Pell, she said. He's been the land agent here for 9 years. And in the last 18 months, he's signed 3 water access amendments that benefit Hutchins exclusively. She put her finger on the relevant line. This one pulls the creek feed off your south pasture access point by rerouting the registered easement 20 yards north. Technically legal. Technically a minor administrative correction. Practically, it means if Hutchins builds a diversion dam here, she pointed to the map, he can cut your herd's water access without technically violating any agreement. Coulter stared at the map for a long time. He hasn't built the dam. Not yet, she said, but the drought gives him the excuse. Water's getting scarce. He starts talking about conservation, protecting his own herd. Suddenly he's got legal cover to build, and you've got nothing to graze on the South Range. She paused. The timing isn't an accident. He's been setting this up. Coulter pushed back from the table and stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her for long enough that she started to wonder whether she'd overstepped, whether she'd pushed too far, too fast, into business that a man like Coulter Vane considered his own to handle in his own way. Then he said, without turning around, "How much of this can you prove?" "The amendments are public record," she said. "I can prove they happened and prove who signed them. I can show the geographic impact on your land. What I can't prove yet is that it was coordinated, that Hutchins directed Pell to make those amendments." "What would prove that?" "Financial records," she said. "If Pell's been compensated by Hutchins beyond his land agent salary, or correspondence, letters, instructions, anything written." She paused. "I don't have access to that." He turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Focused, direct, stripped of the usual careful distance. "Gertrude Holt," he said. She blinked. "What about her?" "Gertrude's brother is the bank clerk in Red Flint. He's the one who processes the land agent's accounts." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "She doesn't like Hutchins. She's never liked him. Her husband sold him a water share 6 years ago under what she calls pressure, and what Hutchins calls a fair transaction, and she's never said a direct word about it, but she remembers." Marlowe looked at him. "You think she'd help?" "I think she might already know more than she said." He turned the hat in his hands. "She watched you at the counter, both times. She was taking your measure. You noticed that." "I noticed things," he said, in a tone that was almost dry, which from Coulter Vane was about as close to wry humor as she'd yet encountered. She almost smiled. "Tomorrow," she said, "at the auction. I'll find a moment to talk to her." He nodded. He put his hat back on the hook. He was about to go back to the barn, his standard end to any conversation that had reached its practical conclusion, and then he stopped and turned back. "This was good work," he said. Straight out, no preamble. She looked at him. He looked back. His face was still that still, set face, but his eyes had something in them that wasn't usual. "Thank you," she said. He went to the barn. She sat at the table for a while longer with the document spread in front of her and Rope's chin on her boot, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not confidence exactly, more like the specific solidity of being useful in a way that mattered, of having found a place where what she was good at was actually needed. It was a dangerous feeling to have the night before something that could go badly in a dozen directions, and she knew it. She folded the documents and put them away and banked the fire and went to bed. The morning of the auction was bright and brutally cold. She dressed in her best clothes, which were not fancy, a dark blue wool skirt and the good coat she'd brought from Pennsylvania, a hat that was presentable but not the battered one she wore for work. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and made no judgments about what she saw, which was itself a kind of daily discipline that cost something. Cisco and Barton had driven the cattle into town the day before. 8 head they were selling, 2-year-olds that Coulter had decided were better as cash against the uncertain season than as mouths to feed through a drought. Coulter drove the wagon with Marlowe beside him, and they arrived in Red Flint as the auction grounds near the livery stable were already filling up with people. She'd never seen the town with this many bodies in it. Every ranching family in the valley, plus buyers from Millhaven, and at least 2 men who had the look of speculators from further east. Good coats, soft hands, the particular alertness of people who were there to find something undervalued and take it. The livery yard had been set up with a rope perimeter around the cattle pen and a wooden platform for the auctioneer. And along the side fence there were tables where the land lease transactions were being handled, and behind one of those tables she could see Pell in his good hat, talking to a man she recognized after a moment as the Hutchins family lawyer. She took all of this in from the wagon as Coulter tied up the horses, and she filed it, and she looked for Gertrude Holt. She found her near the general store's side door, which opened onto the auction grounds. Gertrude had set up a small table selling coffee and baked goods, the practical commerce of a woman who understood that wherever people gathered there was money to be made in the margins. She was moving between the table and the doorway with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times. "Mrs. Holt," Marlowe said. Gertrude looked at her. "Miss Quinn." She poured a coffee without being asked and handed it over, and Marlowe paid for it without being asked, and Gertrude said without preamble and without looking directly at her, "You're here about the water agreements." Marlowe went very still for a half-second, then said, "What do you know about them?" "More than I've said to anyone," Gertrude said. She was arranging baked goods on the table with efficient, precise movements. "My brother processes Pell's accounts. He processes Hutchins' accounts too. He's not a fool, my brother. He sees the same deposits I'd see if I were in his chair." She paused. "He's been worried. He doesn't know what to do with being worried. Has there been," Marlowe chose her word carefully, "irregular compensation?" 3 payments, Gertrude said, still not looking at her. "Over 15 months. Each one after a land amendment went through. The documentation describes them as surveying consultation fees." Her mouth pressed flat for a moment. "Pell hasn't done a survey in 11 years. He pays someone else to do the surveys." Marlowe kept her breath even. "Would your brother say so, if it came to that?" A long pause. Gertrude set down a plate of biscuits and finally looked at Marlowe directly. Her eyes were sharp and tired and decided. "He'd say so to the right people," she said. "The question is whether the right people show up." Marlowe held her gaze. "I intend to find out who the right people are." Gertrude looked at her for a long moment, the same look she'd given her both times at the counter, that reassessment look. Then she said, "Your coffee's getting cold." Marlowe drank her coffee and moved back through the crowd toward where Coulter was standing at the cattle pen, and she found him and stood beside him and said quietly, "I need to tell you what Gertrude just told me." She told him. He listened without moving. When she finished, he said, 3 payments. 3, she said. Timed to the amendments. "That's enough to take to a circuit judge," he said. "If Gertrude's brother will testify, yes." "He'll need protection," Coulter said. "Hutchins will come after him." "I know," she said. The auction was starting. The auctioneer, a rangy man named Corley, who had one of those voices that carried across open land without apparent effort, climbed up onto the platform and started his opening patter, and the crowd shifted and settled around the pen. Coulter's 8 head were in the second lot, and Marlowe stood beside him at the rope line and watched the first lot go through and tried to read the auction's temperature. She saw it within the first 15 minutes. The first lot was from a small operation north of town, a rancher named Fielding, who had 3 children and a wife and a hardscrabble 40 acres that had been producing less and less each year. He was selling 6 head to cover a debt to the feed merchant. The auctioneer ran the bidding up, and then one of the three major buyers. Marlowe had identified them by now. Two Hutchins men and one independent buyer from Millhaven simply stopped bidding at a number that was well below market value and looked at the other Hutchins man, and the other Hutchins man put down his paddle, and the independent buyer was left alone in the bidding, and he bid one more increment, and Corley brought the hammer down. The price Fielding got was 30% below what those animals were worth. Marlowe watched this with the focused attention she'd developed working through columns of numbers at the kitchen table. She turned slightly and saw that the same thing had happened at the land table across the yard. A lease renewal that should have processed cleanly was instead being held up by Pell, who was explaining something to the rancher with the kind of deliberate slowness that created delay without technically obstructing. They were running a system, right here, in front of everyone, and everyone either didn't see it or had decided not to see it. She looked at Coulter. "They're coordinating the bids," she said. "The two Hutchins buyers are suppressing prices and then letting the independent pick up at below value. The independent gets a good deal, Hutchins gets goodwill from a buyer he might need later, and the seller gets nothing." Coulter was watching the pen. "I see it. They'll do the same to your lot. I know. We need to stop it," she said. "Not just for us." He looked at her then. "Fielding," she said. "And whoever's next. If this auction runs the way they've set it up, half a dozen ranches walk away with less than they're owed. Some of them can't absorb that." She held his gaze. "This is bigger than the lease. This is the whole valley." He was quiet. She watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the man who kept to himself, who had stayed out of valley politics for years by choice, being asked to step directly into the center of them. "If I do this," he said slowly, "I'm doing it in front of everyone. There's no taking it back." "I know," she said, "and Hutchins won't let it go. He'll come harder." "He's already coming hard," she said. "He's been coming for 2 years, and you've been standing still." Something moved across his face at that. Not offense, more like recognition. Then Corley called the second lot, and Coulter's cattle walked into the pen, and the Hutchins buyers picked up their paddles, and the machinery of the thing began its next rotation. She watched Coulter Vane stand very still for 3 seconds. Then he picked up his own paddle and turned toward the auction committee table and said, in a voice that carried completely without effort, "Before this lot runs, I've got something to say to this auction." Every head in the yard turned. Warren Hutchins, standing 40 feet away near the land table, went very still. Marlowe stood beside Coulter and kept her face level, and inside her chest something that was equal parts fear and something else. Something that felt, if she was being completely honest, like the ground settling solid under her feet after months of soft earth, moved through her and steadied. This was it. Whatever came next, this was it. The yard went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone drops something that breaks. Sudden, total, and charged with the specific tension of people waiting to see what happens next. Coulter Vane was not a man who made speeches. Everyone in Red Flint Valley knew that. He'd lived among them for 15 years, and he'd said less in aggregate than most men said in a month. So when he raised his voice at a public auction and said he had something to say, every person in that yard understood that whatever came out of his mouth next was not going to be casual. Corley the auctioneer looked down from his platform with the carefully neutral expression of a man calculating whether he needed to be somewhere else. "Mr. Vane," he said, "we're mid-auction." "Then I'll be brief," Coulter said. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His voice had that particular quality, the flat carrying tone of a man who had spent years giving instructions across open land and had never needed to repeat himself. "I just watched the Fielding lot go for 60% of its market value. I'd like someone on the auction committee to explain the bidding structure that produced that number." A murmur moved through the crowd. Marlowe watched it travel, the ranchers processing what they'd just heard, the buyers going still, the two men from the committee table exchanging a look that lasted 1 second too long. Warren Hutchins stepped forward from near the land table. He was a big man, Hutchins, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the particular confidence of someone who had been the largest presence in a room for so long that he'd stopped thinking about it. His face was composed, pleasant even, in the way of a man who was very good at being pleasant when he needed to be. "Coulter," he said, using the first name like they were old friends, which they were not. "Every auction has fluctuations. You know that. The market sets the price." "The market," Coulter said, "or the 3 buyers you brought with you?" Another murmur, louder this time. I didn't bring anyone, Hutchins said. His voice stayed easy, but his eyes had gone to a different temperature entirely. I'm here to buy cattle at fair market prices. Same as any man. Then you won't object to me raising an official complaint with the circuit court about the bidding pattern I observed in the first lot. Coulter reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. The summary Marlowe had written the previous night. 2 hours of work compressed into 2 pages of clean, organized documentation. Coordinated bid suppression, 3 buyers, 2 of whom are on your payroll, systematically withdrawing at price points that keep final bids 20 to 40% below comparable sales in Millhaven. He held the paper up, not threatening, just visible. The crowd shifted. Marlowe could feel it, the specific physical shift of a group of people recalibrating their position, the way you recalibrate when the ground you thought was solid starts telling you something different. She saw Fielding, the rancher from the first lot, turn and look at Coulter with an expression that was complicated and raw. Hutchins' pleasant face had moved fully into something else now. Not anger yet. Men like Hutchins didn't go to anger first. They went to control. You're making a serious accusation, he said. I'm filing a formal complaint, Coulter said. There's a difference. The complaint can be investigated. If I'm wrong, the investigation will say so. Based on what evidence? Hutchins said. Your opinion of the bidding? And here was the moment. Marlowe felt it like a change in air pressure. She stepped forward. She did it without announcement, without ceremony. Just moved up to stand beside Coulter, close enough that her shoulder was level with his arm. And she looked at Warren Hutchins across the 20 feet of frozen auction yard, and she said, clearly enough for the crowd around them to hear, based on the water access amendments, Mr. Hutchins, the ones that Pell filed on your behalf over the past 18 months, the ones he was compensated for privately 3 times, in amounts that the bank records describe as surveying consultation fees, for surveys Pell hasn't personally conducted in over a decade. The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than the one before. It was the silence of something having been said that could not be unsaid. Hutchins stared at her. She held his gaze. She was aware of the crowd in her peripheral vision, the turned faces, the held breath. And she was aware of Coulter standing beside her, very still, and she kept her eyes on Hutchins and kept her face level and waited. She'd known, when she stepped forward, that this was the moment it was going to come. Hutchins needed somewhere to redirect, and a man like Hutchins redirected instinctively toward the weakest-looking target, and she knew exactly what she looked like to him. He didn't disappoint. His voice shifted. The pleasantness dropped entirely now, replaced by something that was meant to be contempt, but had the quality of a man reaching for a weapon he expected to be there. This is what you're bringing to an auction, he said. The word of a woman who's been on this valley 4 months. A woman Coulter Vane found through a mail-order agency because no one else would take the position. He looked at the crowd, not at her, working the room the way men like him always worked a room. Seeking the laughter, the nods, the permission. A woman who clearly doesn't understand what she's looking at. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One man near the back laughed, short and uncertain. Marlowe stood still. The documents are public record, she said. Her voice didn't waver. She'd made a decision the night before, lying in the dark listening to the wind, that she was going to say what needed to be said, and she was not going to perform hurt while she said it. Anyone here can request them from the Millhaven Land Office. The amendments are registered. The geographic impact is documented. I've mapped the proposed diversion point against the registered easement on the Vane South pasture, and I'd be happy to show that map to any circuit judge in the territory. You mapped it, Hutchins said. The contempt in his voice was total now and unguarded, which was a mistake she noticed but didn't point to yet. I mapped it, she said. It took me most of an afternoon. The math isn't complicated. Another shift in the crowd. Someone said something low that she couldn't hear. She caught Gertrude Holt near the store doorway, watching with her arms folded and her face set. Hutchins took a half step toward her. He was still going to the contempt well because it had always worked before. She could see it, the way a man relies on a tool that's never let him down without accounting for the possibility that the tool might fail. You come out here with your paper and your maps, and you think you understand this valley, he said, loud enough now that it was clearly a performance, clearly aimed at the crowd around them. You've been here 5 minutes. You don't know this land, you don't know these people, and you sure as... That's enough. 2 words. Coulter's voice. Flat and final, like a gate swinging shut. Hutchins stopped. The yard went absolutely still. Coulter took 1 step forward, and he looked at Warren Hutchins with those washed-out gray eyes, and his face had the expression of a man who has finished being patient. Not rage, nothing as hot as rage, but the specific cold resolution of a man who has decided exactly how far this goes and has located the line precisely. You want to talk about what she doesn't know, Coulter said. I'll tell you what she knows. She knows how to pull a heifer out of a frozen gully in the dark without losing the animal. She knows how to keep a household running on what most men would call nothing. She knows how to read a ledger and how to cross-reference a public record and how to see what's in front of her without looking away from it, which is more than I can say for most of the people in this yard, including me, for the past 2 years. He wasn't loud. He wasn't performing. He was just saying it, straight and without decoration, the way he said everything. She came out here because she needed a place and I needed help. And neither one of us had a lot of choices, he said. I'll tell you what she found when she got here. She found a ranch that was being strangled slow by a man who was too careful to leave obvious marks. She found the paperwork that proves it. She organized it clearly enough that a circuit judge can read it in 20 minutes. He paused. Now you want to stand here and tell this valley that her word doesn't count because of what she looks like or where she came from. You want to make her the subject of this conversation instead of the evidence she brought. Hutchins' jaw was tight. I've been watching you do that to people for 2 years, Coulter said. Make the person the subject instead of their evidence. Fielding. The Anson brothers when they sold. The Creedy widow. You make it personal and you make it loud, and most people back down because nobody wants to be made the subject. He looked at Hutchins steadily. I'm not backing down, and neither is she. The silence lasted long enough to become something else. Not the silence of waiting, but the silence of a crowd doing its own internal recalculation, person by person, the slow collective shift of people who have been sitting with a discomfort they hadn't named yet and have just been handed the name. Marlowe was aware that her hands were shaking slightly inside her coat pockets. She kept them there. She kept her face level. She breathed. Hutchins looked at the crowd. He was looking for the room he'd had 30 seconds ago, and it wasn't there anymore. The men who'd laughed weren't laughing. The committee members were looking at the table. Pell had moved 2 steps back from where he'd been standing, a physical retreat so obvious it might as well have been a confession. This isn't over, Hutchins said. It came out rougher than he'd intended. No, Coulter agreed. It's not. That's why she's filing the complaint with the circuit court on Monday. He looked at Marlowe. You have the documentation. I have everything, she said. She did. She'd been carrying it inside her coat since they left the ranch that morning. The ledger summary, the maps, the copies she'd made of the Millhaven records, the written account Gertrude Holt had slipped under the kitchen door before dawn that morning. 2 pages in her brother's handwriting detailing the 3 irregular payments with dates, amounts, and a statement that he was prepared to swear to their accuracy before a judge. She hadn't told Coulter about the note from Gertrude's brother yet. She'd been saving it for the moment when it would matter most, which had turned out to be approximately now. She produced it from her coat. She held it up the same way Coulter had held up the complaint document, just visible, just present. She didn't announce what it was. She let Hutchins look at it. She watched his face move through a series of calculations. That's a sworn account, she said quietly. Just for him now, the performance done, down to the plain mechanics. From someone with direct knowledge of the payments. You can try to discredit him. I imagine you will. But it's in writing and it's dated, and the circuit judge will have a copy before you've had a chance to make the call you're thinking about making right now. Hutchins stared at her. And she saw it. The moment a man realizes that the ground he thought was his has been methodically mapped and documented by someone he'd decided wasn't worth watching. It wasn't a collapse. Men like Hutchins didn't collapse in public. But something behind his eyes recalculated, and what it produced was retreat dressed up as dignity. He turned and said something to his lawyer, low and clipped, and the lawyer bent toward him and said something back. And then Hutchins straightened and looked at the auction yard with an expression that said this conversation was beneath him, and had always been beneath him, which was the last tool he had left. Run the auction, Corley, he said, and walked toward the land table. Corley looked at the cattle pen and then at Coulter and then at the crowd, and he cleared his throat and said, "Second lot, Vane cattle. We'll start the bidding. At honest market rate," said a voice from the crowd. Marlowe looked. It was Fielding, the rancher from the first lot, the man with 3 children and a hardscrabble 40 acres. He was standing with his hat in his hands, and his face was the face of a man who had just understood something that had been done to him and was deciding what to do with that understanding. "Market rate," said another voice, and another. Corley adjusted his hat and ran the second lot at market rate. Then he ran the third lot at market rate. By the fourth lot, the 2 Hutchins buyers had quietly put down their paddles and were standing at the edge of the yard with the specific body language of men who wanted to be somewhere else. Coulter's 8 head sold for 22% more than his last auction return. He said nothing about this afterward. He collected the payment and folded the cash into his coat, and he found Marlowe at the edge of the crowd near Gertrude Holt's coffee table, and he looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "Your brother's note," she said to Gertrude. "I used it." Gertrude poured a coffee and handed it to her. "I know," she said. "I watched." She poured a second one and handed it to Coulter. "My brother's been wanting to say something for 8 months. He'll say it in court if you need him to." "We'll need him to," Coulter said. Gertrude nodded. She looked at Marlowe with that appraising expression one more time, and then she said briefly and without sentiment, "You did well." She turned back to her table and began stacking cups with efficient, practiced movements, and that was that. Marlowe drank her coffee. The auction yard was thinning out around them. She could see Hutchins at the far end near the road, still talking to his lawyer, and she watched them without being obvious about it, and tried to read the conversation from the posture, and what she read was not relief. Hutchins was not a man who was done. He was a man who was recalculating, and the recalculation was not gentle. She said this to Coulter quietly when they were loading the wagon. "I know," he said. "He'll move faster now," she said. "We pushed him in public. He'll want to do something that reasserts control before the circuit judge gets involved." "The water," Coulter said. "The water," she agreed. "If he builds that diversion dam before the court has a chance to review the easement amendments, he creates a fact on the ground that's harder to undo than a document." Coulter was quiet for a moment, loading a grain sack with the efficient economy of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "How fast can he build it?" "If he throws men at it, a week. Maybe less. The ground's frozen, but the creek bed doesn't require deep foundation work. It's a diversion, not a dam. Logs and packed earth." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I grew up near a working creek," she said. "My father diverted a tributary for the East Field when I was 12. I watched them build it." She paused. "I know what it takes." He looked at her for a long moment in the thin winter light, with the noise of the breaking up auction around them, and the cold coming in off the mountains, and the particular weight of a day that had changed several things at once, pressing down on both of them. "All right," he said, "what do we do?" She climbed up onto the wagon and sat down and looked at the road back toward the ranch, and she thought about the creek and the south pasture and the frozen ground and the week they might or might not have, and she pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was deciding something. "We go home," she said. "We send for the circuit judge tonight, and tomorrow morning, before first light, we start documenting the creek access." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Cisco and Barton?" he asked. "All of us," she said. He clicked the horses forward, and the wagon moved out of Red Flint, and the town fell away behind them, and neither of them spoke for a while. The mountains were purple-gray in the late afternoon, and the sky was doing what it always did out here at this hour, going from hard blue to something softer and colder at the same time, the light dropping, but not gently. Somewhere behind them, she knew, Warren Hutchins was making a phone call, or writing a letter, or sitting across from his lawyer talking about what came next. The thing she'd started today couldn't be unstarted. She'd known that when she stepped forward, and she'd stepped forward anyway, and now they were on the other side of it, and the road ahead was uncertain in ways she couldn't fully map yet. She sat with that, with the uncertainty and the cold and the specific exhaustion of a day that had cost her something. And she didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. It was what it was. She'd done what she came to do today, and tomorrow she'd do what tomorrow needed. Rope was waiting at the ranch gate when they pulled up, tail moving. He walked beside the wagon to the barn and sat outside while they unhitched the horses. And then he followed Marlowe to the house and settled under the kitchen table while she started the fire. Coulter came in an hour later. He sat down at the table across from her. She put supper in front of him. He ate for a while in silence, and then he said, without looking up from his plate, "What you said today. About the documents, the maps." He paused. "I didn't know you'd gone that far with it." "I didn't want to say anything until I had enough," she said. He looked up at her then. "You had enough." "I had enough today," she said. "Yesterday I wasn't sure." He turned his fork in his hand. He had the look of a man who was trying to say something he hadn't had much practice saying. "I should have asked," he said, "what you were working on. I let you carry it alone." She considered this. It was an honest thing to say, and it had cost him something to say it, and she wasn't going to brush it off or make it easy with a quick reassurance that would let him off the hook. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She paused. "But you stood up today when it counted. That means something too." He held her gaze for a moment. "It should have meant something sooner." "Maybe," she said. "But we're here now." He nodded once. He finished his supper. He drank his coffee. He stayed at the table longer than he usually did, and she worked on the documents across from him, and Rope slept under the table, and the fire kept the cold at a reasonable distance, and outside the night settled in over Red Flint Valley hard and complete and full of whatever was coming next. They were at the creek before the sun came up. Marlowe had barely slept. She'd lain in the dark of her room running through everything, the documents, the timeline, the probable moves Hutchins would make and when. And somewhere around 3 in the morning she'd stopped pretending to sleep and gotten up and rebuilt the kitchen fire and sat at the table with the maps until the sky outside went from black to the specific dark gray that comes just before color returns to the world. Coulter was already outside. She could hear him moving in the barn. She packed the documentation into the leather satchel she'd brought from Pennsylvania, the one her father had used for his own farm records, worn at the corners, still solid. And she put on every layer she owned, and she went out into the cold. Cisco and Barton were there. Coulter had told them the night before, and they'd come without question, which meant something. Barton had brought tools, stakes and rope and a measuring line, without being asked, which meant he'd already understood what they were doing and why it needed doing before dawn. Cisco had brought coffee in a battered tin pot that he set directly on a small fire he'd built at the edge of the creek bank, and he handed cups around with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that this was going to be a long morning and they might as well start it right. The creek was low, lower than Marlowe had seen it in her months on the ranch, running in a thin dark ribbon between banks of frozen mud. She crouched at the water's edge and looked upstream toward the point she'd marked on the map, the bend in the creek where the amended easement allowed for what the document called a water management structure, which was the bureaucratic language for a diversion dam, and she could see from here that the ground on the upstream bank had been disturbed recently. Boot prints in the frozen mud, a survey stake she hadn't put there. She stood up and looked at Coulter. He was looking at the same stake. "He's already been here," she said. "Sometime in the last 2 days," Coulter said. Barton crouched near the stake and looked at it without touching it. Survey stake. Recent. The mud still cracked around the base from where they drove it. "He's moving faster than a week," Marlowe said. "He knew the auction was coming," Coulter said. "He was already staged." She absorbed this. It meant the auction confrontation hadn't accelerated Hutchins' timeline. He'd already been moving. It meant that what they'd done yesterday was necessary, but it hadn't stopped anything, only changed the visibility of it. And it meant they had less time than she'd calculated. "I need to document this," she said. She opened the satchel and took out paper and made a sketch of the stake's position relative to the creek bend, marked with measurements that Barton called out as he worked the measuring line. She marked the boot prints. She noted the date and time in the margin. They worked for 2 hours, moving systematically upstream from the survey stake, documenting every piece of disturbed ground, every mark of recent human activity. They found 3 more stakes and the beginnings of a cleared area where trees had been cut back from the bank. Fresh cuts, pale wood still visible at the stumps. Whoever Hutchins had sent had cleared enough space for a work crew to operate. By the time the sun was fully up and the cold had settled in with its full morning weight, Marlowe had 6 pages of documentation. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. Cisco had refilled the coffee pot twice. "This is enough," she told Coulter. Combined with what we already have, this shows active preparation. He didn't just file paperwork, he's mobilized a crew. A judge can issue an injunction to halt construction before it starts. How fast can we get a judge? He said. I sent the letter last night, she said, to the circuit court in Mill Haven. I asked for an emergency review. He looked at her. Last night? While you were in the barn, she said, I asked Gertrude to have it in the first Morning Post. He was quiet for a moment. There was a version of this where a man felt managed, where having someone move 3 steps ahead of him felt like a challenge to his authority. She'd thought about that the night before while she was writing the letter. She'd written it anyway. Good, he said. That was all. Just good. She let out a breath she hadn't fully realized she was holding. The circuit judge's name was Aldous Crane, and he arrived in Red Flint 4 days later, which was faster than anyone expected, and which Gertrude Holt attributed to the fact that Judge Crane had apparently heard the name Hutchins before in a context that had not been favorable. He was a small, dry man in his 60s, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people tell him things that weren't true, and had developed an excellent nose for the architecture of a lie. He set up in the back room of the general store, Gertrude's contribution, and he reviewed documents for half a day before he asked to speak to anyone. The first person he asked to speak to was Marlowe. She sat across from him at Gertrude's back table with her satchel open in front of her, and she walked him through everything. The water access amendments, the geographic mapping, the payment records from Gertrude's brother, the creek documentation, the auction pattern. She put each document in front of him in the order she'd organized them, and she explained each one clearly and without embellishment, and she answered his questions directly. And when she didn't know something, she said she didn't know, rather than guessing. Crane listened to all of it without expression. When she finished, he looked at the documents arranged on the table and was quiet for a long moment. You organized all of this yourself, he said. Yes. In how long? About 6 weeks, once I understood what I was looking at. He looked at her over the top of the papers. What did you do before you came to Red Flint Valley? Kept my father's farm accounts, she said. Hogs and chickens, not cattle. Hogs and chickens, he said, in a tone that wasn't dismissive, more like he was recalibrating something. The numbers work the same regardless of what the animals are, she said. A pause. Then something that might have been a brief, dry smile crossed his face and was gone. Indeed they do, he said. He straightened the papers into a neat stack. I'll need to speak with the man from the bank. He's waiting outside, she said. Crane looked up. Gertrude's brother, she said. He came this morning. He's been wanting to say something for 8 months. Crane studied her for one more moment. Then he said, Send him in. She came out of the back room and found Coulter standing near the front counter with his hat in his hands. The exact posture, she thought, of a man who was not good at waiting but was doing it anyway because there was nothing else to be done. Barton was outside. Cisco was outside. Half of Red Flint was apparently outside, because word had gotten around that a circuit judge was in the back of the general store, and the entire valley had decided it needed coffee and dry goods today. She looked at Coulter and gave him a small nod. It's going well. And he let out a breath and his shoulders dropped about half an inch. Gertrude's brother, she said. Crane wants him now. Gertrude produced her brother from the corner where he'd been sitting with a cup of coffee and a face so tightly controlled it was practically vibrating. He was a slight, neat man named Ellison, younger than Gertrude by several years, with the careful posture of someone who had been frightened for a long time and had just decided to stop. She put her hand briefly on his arm as he passed. You're doing the right thing, she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who needed to hear that and hadn't expected it from her specifically. Then he squared his shoulders and went into the back room. Coulter appeared at her elbow. Hutchins is outside, he said low. He's been outside for an hour, he and his lawyer. She'd known this was coming. Hutchins had known about Crane's arrival. There were no secrets in a valley this small, and his presence outside was a pressure tactic as much as anything. He wanted them to know he was watching. He wanted them to feel the weight of who he was. Let him wait, she said. He'll want to present his own version to Crane, Coulter said. He's entitled to, she said. Crane will hear him. That's the process. We've given the judge everything we have. The rest is up to him. Coulter looked at her. There was something in his expression that she'd been seeing more of lately, a kind of attention that was different from the early weeks when he'd looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. This was something more direct, more present. "You're not worried," he said. "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "I just don't have anything useful to add to it." He looked at her for a moment and then said quietly, "I haven't said what you've done here, for this ranch. I don't say things like this easily." "I know you don't," she said. "That's not an excuse," he said. "It's just, I know what you put into this. I know what it cost you." He paused, and she could see him working for the words the way he worked for everything, said steadily, without shortcuts. "You came out here and you didn't get what most people would consider a fair situation. You got a cold house and hard work, and people who weren't kind to you. And you stayed and you worked and you built something that's going to save this ranch." He stopped. He looked at his hat. "I don't take that lightly." She stood with this for a moment. It was a real thing, he'd said. Not polished, not easy, real. She decided to give him something real back. "I stayed because it was worth staying for," she said. "The land is good, the work is honest, and you—" She paused, picking her own words carefully. "You treated me like someone who could do the job. You didn't make it easy, but you made it fair. That's rarer than you probably know." He looked up from his hat. "Also, your dog liked me from the first day," she said. "I took that as a reasonable sign." He almost smiled, fully smiled actually, a small thing, a brief thing. But it was there, and it changed his whole face in a way that made him look less like a man permanently braced for impact. Before either of them could say anything else, the backroom door opened and Judge Crane came out. The general store had gone quiet. Everyone who'd come in for coffee and dry goods was watching. Gertrude had stopped stacking cans. Even the sound from outside seemed to dim. Crane looked at Coulter and Marlowe and said, "I've reviewed the documentation and heard from Mr. Ellison. I'm issuing an immediate injunction halting any construction activity on the creek easement pending full review of the amendment process." He paused and looked at the documents in his hand. "I'm also referring the payment records to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for review of potential misconduct by the land agent." Another pause. "The auction committee will receive a formal notice of investigation regarding bidding practice irregularities." He said it the way judges said things. Flat, procedural, without drama. What it meant was anything but flat. Gertrude Holt put both hands on her counter and let out a long, slow breath. Ellison came out of the back room looking like a man who had put down something very heavy and was still figuring out what to do with his arms. Coulter said nothing. He stood very still and looked at the documents in Crane's hand, and his jaw worked once, and then he looked at Marlowe, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have fit inside the moment. She felt it then. The specific, quiet sensation of a thing she had built doing what it was built to do. Not triumph, exactly. More like the feeling after you've been pushing against a wall for a long time and the wall finally moves. The absence of resistance. She was aware that her eyes were stinging slightly. She blinked it away. Hutchins came in from outside. His lawyer was behind him. He'd clearly been told something by someone because his face had already reorganized itself into the controlled expression of a man who was not finished but was changing his approach. He looked at Crane. "Judge?" "Mr. Hutchins," Crane said, with the specific patient tone of a man who has been doing this for 30 years. "I'll be available to hear your response to these findings tomorrow morning at 8. You and your counsel are welcome to present any documentation you believe is relevant." He tucked the papers under his arm. "Today we're done." Hutchins looked at Marlowe. She met his eyes and held them. She didn't gloat. There was nothing in her face that invited him to feel anything about her, but she held his gaze steady and even and level. The same way she'd looked at him across the auction yard. The same way she'd looked at him across 20 years of other men and women who'd decided what she was before she'd had a chance to open her mouth. He looked away first. That was all. He just looked away and turned and went back out the door with his lawyer, and the bell above the door rang once and then was quiet. The investigation that followed took 6 weeks. Pell resigned from the land agent position before it concluded, quietly, in writing, citing health concerns that no one believed but no one challenged, because the outcome was the same either way. The three water access amendments were voided by the Territorial Land Board on the grounds of procedural irregularity, which was the official language for corruption, and the creek easement reverted to its original terms. The auction committee was restructured, with two of the three members replaced by ranchers elected by the valley community. Hutchins' lawyer managed to keep the misconduct charges from producing criminal proceedings. Money had a way of doing that. But the investigation had cost Hutchins something that money couldn't fully buy back: the appearance of being untouchable. Warren Hutchins did not expand further into Red Flint Valley. He pulled back quietly, in the way that powerful men pull back when the exposure of their methods costs more than the gains. Not defeated exactly, but recalibrated. Marlowe watched this process with the same attention she'd given everything else about him. And she noted it, and she didn't celebrate it because celebration implied that it was over. And she'd learned enough about men like Hutchins to know that over was a word you used carefully. But the dam wasn't built. The water ran south. The cattle on the Vane Ranch drank from the same creek they'd always drunk from, and by the time spring came, the flow had increased from the winter's late snow, running higher than it had in 2 seasons. She was at the creek the morning the water came back strong. She'd gotten into the habit of checking it daily, a habit she suspected she'd keep for years. And she stood on the bank and watched the water move and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who understands that what they did mattered in a way that would outlast the doing of it. The valley was still hard. The work was still relentless. The mornings were still cold and the pump still stuck, and August the gray gelding was still unreliable in cold weather and probably always would be. But the water ran. Dutch had left the ranch in March. He'd found work on the Hutchins spread, which said everything that needed saying, and Marlowe had watched him go without much feeling either way. Coulter hired a young hand named Perry, who was green as spring grass and willing to learn, and Cisco took him on with the patient energy of someone who'd always had a gift for teaching. Barton remained Barton, still sparing with words, still watching everything. But he'd stopped that waiting quality, the waiting to be proved right, and in its place had settled something that functioned in Barton's economy of expression as respect. The town took longer than the ranch. It always does with towns. A ranch is a contained system. You prove yourself to the people in the yard and the proof holds. A town is 100 separate calculations running simultaneously, and some of them are slower than others and some of them don't update at all. There were people in Red Flint who were going to look at Marlowe Quinn the same way they'd looked at her stepping off Dupree's wagon no matter what she did, because those people's opinions weren't actually about her. They were about something fixed inside themselves that she didn't have the power or the interest to change. She'd made her peace with that somewhere around the 6th week, standing at Gertrude's counter while 2 women near the window pretended not to watch her, and she'd decided then that she was not in this valley to change everyone's mind. She was here to do what she was here to do, and the people whose minds changed would change them. And the ones who didn't could carry their own weight. What she hadn't counted on was Fielding. He came to the ranch in April, on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a wagon with his wife and his 3 kids. Marlowe was in the yard when they pulled up. She didn't know why they were there, and she stood with her hands on the fence post and watched them come. Fielding climbed down and took off his hat and said, "My wife made something." His wife produced a covered dish from the back of the wagon. Marlowe didn't know what was in it. She would find out it was a preserves pie, the kind that took all day. "You didn't have to," Marlowe started. "That cattle money was the difference between us making it through spring or not," Fielding said, flat and direct, not dressed up. "I didn't know what they were doing to the auction until you said it out loud. I should have seen it myself. I didn't." He looked at his hat. "So," his wife held out this pie with both hands and looked at Marlowe with an expression that said everything the pie was supposed to say, and Marlowe took it. "Thank you," she said. The Fielding kids had already found Rope, who was working through his professional obligation to investigate every new person who came through the gate. The youngest one, a girl of maybe 6, had both arms around the dog's neck and was talking into his ear about something Rope appeared to be following closely. Fielding put his hat back on. "Word is you're keeping the ranch accounts now," he said. "Officially." She looked at him. "Coulter asked me to take them on permanently. Yes." "You do good work," Fielding said. It came out a little rough, like compliments were slightly foreign to his mouth. "I was wondering, not this week, when you have time, whether you'd be willing to look at mine. I pay. I've just never been confident in my own numbers, and I'd rather have someone who knows what they're doing. She thought about this for a moment. Bring them whenever you're ready, she said. I'll take a look. He nodded, turned back to his wagon, then stopped and turned back. That woman, Vera Hutchins, she said things at the store about you before all this. He was looking at the wagon, not at her. Most of us heard it and didn't say anything, and we should have. He paused. I don't know how to fix that. You just did, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze and let him see that she meant it. And after a moment, he nodded once and climbed up to his wagon and turned his team around and drove out with his wife and his kids and the 6-year-old who'd had to be gently removed from Rope's neck. She stood in the yard for a while after they left, holding the pie. Coulter came out of the barn and looked at the pie and looked at her. Fielding, she said. I saw the wagon. He looked at the pie. What's in it? Preserves, she said. I think. He considered this. We should probably check. Probably, she said. They went inside. She put the pie on the kitchen table and they sat down with it between them. And Coulter found a knife and cut 2 pieces with the careful precision of a man who took even the simple things seriously. And he put hers in front of her and she ate it. And it was good. Not perfect. A little heavy on the sweet, but made with care, which was its own kind of perfection. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the spring wind was moving differently than the winter wind. Lighter, less intent, carrying something that was almost promise instead of threat. The creek was running full somewhere beyond the yard. Rope was under the table. Coulter ate his piece of pie without saying anything for a while, and then he said, Crane sent word. The easement restoration is finalized. Official record. I know, she said. Gertrude told me yesterday. He looked at her. Gertrude tells you things before she tells me. Gertrude likes me, Marlowe said. Gertrude doesn't like anyone, he said. She likes me a little, she said. He looked down at his plate and something moved in his face. That brief thing, that real thing, that she'd been seeing more of since the auction. I want to change the arrangement, he said. She went still. Not... He caught her expression and said quickly, I mean the formal arrangement from the agency. He stopped and looked at his hands on the table. That arrangement was a practical thing, a household arrangement. What this is, what you are, to this ranch, to the work, it's not that anymore. He paused. It hasn't been that for a while. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this easily, and she could see what it was costing him, and she sat with it rather than rushing past it. What are you asking me? She said. Quiet, direct. He looked up. Those washed-out gray eyes, the ones that didn't give much away, were giving something away now. I'm asking if you want to stay, he said. Not on the agency terms. On your own terms. As a partner. This ranch is as much yours as mine. What you've done for it makes that true, whether I say so formally or not. But I want to say so formally. He paused. And I want to say the other thing, too, that it's not only the ranch. She heard this. She let herself hear the whole of it. She'd come to Red Flint Valley with nothing but a worn bag and a stubborn jaw and a set of skills that nobody out here had thought to value yet. She'd come because her options had narrowed and the world had seemed to be telling her, in its various ways, that she should be grateful for whatever she could get. She'd spent 26 years being told, in the specific language that people used about women who looked like her, that what she was the sum of what she appeared to be at first glance, large, inconvenient, easy to dismiss. What she'd found in this hard valley, in this cold house, beside this difficult man, was not what she'd expected to find. She'd found that the qualities she'd always had, the stubbornness, the patience, the habit of looking at a problem until she understood it, were not consolation prizes for the things she lacked. They were the things that mattered, the things that, when tested against real stakes, had held. She'd known who she was before Red Flint Valley. But she'd learned, out here in the dust and the cold and the work, what who she was could actually do. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. But, she said, I want the North Range water access in writing, officially, under my name as well as yours. He looked at her for a moment and then, done. And Perry needs a raise, she said. He's doing the work of 2 hands and we're paying him like a beginner. He is a beginner, Coulter said. He's a fast learner, she said. Investing in fast learners is better economics than replacing slow ones. He considered this with the face of a man who was running the numbers. All right, he said. Done. And we should fix the back door gap before next winter, she said. Properly. Not cloth. Marlowe, he said. Yes? I'm asking you to be my partner and you're negotiating property terms. She looked at him. You'd rather I didn't? He looked back. No, he said. I'd rather you always did. She ate the last bite of her pie. Outside, the wind moved through the valley the way wind does in spring. Not harsh, not gentle, just present, doing what wind does, indifferent to the small human calculations happening inside one warm kitchen in one ranch in one stretch of hard country that most people never thought about. But some things were decided in that kitchen that afternoon that would hold for a long time. Not because they were sealed with ceremony or witnessed by anyone except a cattle dog under a table, because they were made by two people who had looked at each other clearly, had seen the imperfect, complicated, unglamorous truth of what the other was, and had decided that the truth was enough, was more than enough. Marlowe Quinn had stepped off a wagon in Red Flint Valley, and the whole town had laughed, and she'd carried that laughter for months like a stone in her chest, and she'd kept going, and what she'd found on the other side of keeping going was not vindication. It wasn't the town's applause or their changed minds, or any version of the world deciding she'd been right all along. What she'd found was simpler than that and harder to take away. She'd found the specific dignity of a woman who showed up, did the work, and refused to let anyone else's idea of her become her idea of herself. That was the thing nobody could give her. Nobody could have handed it to her on the wagon ride in or told her it was coming or guaranteed it would be there at the end. She had to make it herself, day by day, in the cold and the mud and the unglamorous dailiness of a life that asked more than it gave and then asked again. She'd made it. The pie was good. The creek was running. The door still had a gap in it, but they'd fix it before winter. That was enough for one day.